Father in heaven, as we come this morning, we ask for your continued blessings as we think about your plan for us. And really your, again, very comprehensive plan for this creation, this earth, and the future for us. And as we think about the unseen realm, and that's the topic, we ask that you would continue to give us wisdom and really knowing that you didn't need to provide this information to us, but you have in somewhat of a limited way, but we'll take it. And so we ask for your blessing today. In Jesus' name, amen. So, on that note, we have, I think about Jesus' comment remember when he was talking to the disciples, he said, you guys are no longer servants, I call you friends. Because you're my friends, I'm going to give you insight into his plan. And so I see this topic, here on Session 12, that there's bits and pieces of this whole topic around, in the Bible is what I mean. And so you have, we have some insight, but not the full insight. But what we want to do today is as we begin to move on in looking at our destiny. That's ultimately what we're after, is our destiny. Is in understanding how the spiritual realm, the unseen realm, the heavenly host, if you wanted to say that, how they interact with us. And so we're going to see a couple things today in the beginning. But here we're going to talk about the image of God and what it means and doesn't mean, some of the ramifications for that. One of the things that there on number one is it's fascinating how scholars, Old Testament scholars, especially if you go of the more theologically liberal type, this is not a political comment, but more theological, that they will make a comment that, well, there's two different creation accounts. Genesis 1 and 2. And these two different creation accounts contradict one another. They're, over here it says there's land and then there's no land, and then, and you read them and you go, that's really not what's going on here. So what you see is, especially the book of Genesis, what I want to talk about, and we'll see this a little bit, is how the book of Genesis is organized. It's 50 chapters, and but in Genesis 1, we're not going to go through it, except to say we know what happens in Genesis 1. God creates the world in 6 days, and he rests on the seventh day. But what he does is, the Bible is about God's plan of redemption and reconciliation for humanity. And he does give us insights into, again, this other group, these Elohim that we've been talking about, all the spiritual beings, the angels, the ones that have rebelled and not rebelled. But when you think about God's plan, think about back here in eternity. God has this plan. When let's say it's just when God's alone, there's no angels yet, or any other creatures, just the Trinity. And he's planning, he's got this thought in his mind about having family. We've talked about that. Well, then what we know is, just right here on the sheet, that God creates the heavens, and then he creates the physical heavens, and then he creates the earth in order to accomplish his plan for us. So when you think about, those of you more science-minded, the Anthropic Principle. You guys ever heard of that?
Yeah.
What does it mean? Help us out.
Decay. Right?
No, that's entropy. But what's the Anthropic Principle?
I don't remember.
This is the principle that if you look at how the universe exists, but specifically the earth is just at the right distance from the sun is just the right color, the temperature finely tuned, right? So God's looking at, he creates this big universe, and he creates all the galaxies, hundreds of billions of galaxies, and then in our galaxy he creates this star, and then he decides to create, he actually created the earth first and everything around it, but he puts us at just the right spot in order to make it habitable for us, right? And so, right gravity, everything. So you think about that, he creates this in the first 6 days. Let's just go to day 5. He's creating this, the land and everything else, and then finally in order to create us, human, what does he create us out of?
The
dirt, right? So he creates the dirt first, and then he creates us out of the dirt. So it's interesting here at number 1 there that the Hebrew word for dirt or ground is Adamah. Well, that's kind of a feminine word, and the masculine word is Adam, Adam. So it makes sense that here's this guy, creates him out of the dirt, and he's called dirt, or the male version of dirt. And so we also know that what the Bible teaches, we see scientifically that we have calcium and we have iron and we have all the things of the dirt in our system. Okay, but notice there, I love Psalm 115. The heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to mankind. So our administration, our domain, makes sense that it's physical and it's on earth. That's why it makes me wonder, will we ever colonize Mars? I have a feeling that we won't. Because God says, I didn't give you Mars. I didn't give you the moon. I gave you Earth. And so that's just an interesting question. But when we talk about images, so number 1, God creates the heavens, and then he shapes the earth, forms it in such a way so that we can live on it. It's our domain. Number 2, going back here to Genesis 1 and 2, I just threw 5,000 BC in there just so that we can have a number, as it relates to chronology. What we do know is that when God laid the foundation, well, I'll read it here, Job 38. God is talking to Job. Number 2 there, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So, page 1, number 2. That's what I'm reading. When God lays the foundation and creates the earth, the angels are already there. They're already existing, right? We saw this. Where they're there, and God had created what we've gone through, this spiritual family, this divine council. So now you have the spiritual family, and you have him creating the necessary requirements for the creation of this earthly physical family. And so they already existed as he was beginning to shape things. All right, that's important. Then number 3 there, God's plan involved his invitation to the heavenly divine council to join him in seeing the creation of an earthly family who would also be imagers of God himself. We're going to talk about imagers in a minute. This would allow humanity to be God's representatives or vice-regents in establishing God's rulership throughout the entire earth. So, as we get into Genesis 1 here, God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps. Now, you can see I bolded there, us, our, and our. And scholars will wrestle with this. Now, for us as Christians, usually what do we think is being described here?
Trinity.
The Trinity. And that would be a great thing of reading the New Testament back into the Old, which is bad. The Old Testament has to speak for itself, okay? Not that the Bible isn't a unified book, but when you interpret something, you don't bring New Testament theology in. That would be foreign to the way that it was written. Is it possible? Maybe. We know that God's a Trinity. But most of the time, well, you can see on the bottom there in the notes, I put a footnote there. This is from the Net version in their notes, and they go through all the different descriptions of how scholars have wrestled with this. I kind of throw that out there for you. But the bold section there, if this is the case, that this is referring to God speaking to his divine counsel, okay, we'll do it this way. We have the spiritual realm up here. We'll just put host, and then we have earthly. And as we've been talking about, that God is up here, Yahweh, and he says, "Hey guys, hey, let's make some earthly family. Let's create man and make him in our image." So what you have then is you have here this image that the spiritual family also enjoys. They are made also in the image of God. We don't have a history of that. Remember, God hasn't given us the history of the creation of the spiritual realm. He's just given us our history in the Bible. But it's in bold there. This is what they say. If this is the case, God invites the heavenly court, I'm at the bottom in the bold, to participate in the creation of mankind, perhaps in the role of offering praise, as we saw in Job 38, but he himself is the one who does the actual creative work. Of course, this view does assume that the members of the divine, or of the heavenly court, possess the divine image in some way. Since the image is closely associated with rulership, perhaps they share the divine image in that they, together with God and under his royal authority, are the executive authority over the world. So what did we saw? I guess I'll say this. What have we been seeing? When we covered all the heavenly host, we saw the divine council. We saw that they participate in giving decrees. Remember that? In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar gets confronted because he's so arrogant. And he has to go out in the wilderness. And remember, his fingernails grow long, his hair grows long. And it says, this is the decree of the watchers. So we know that they rule. We know that they're part of the divine council. They're part of God's rulership. Not that God needs them, but he chooses to invite them to do that. So here, in this case, he says, hey, I got something else that I'm doing. I'm going to create an earthly family. I've created the earth. I've just shaped it for 6 days. And on the 6th day, he says, let's make man in our image so that he can rule here on earth, in the earthly realm. And let him be our image bearers. Notice in Genesis 3:22, after the fall, we'll get there next week, Lord willing. Then the Lord said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might stretch his hand and take of the tree of life. So what's fascinating now is the question, is God, he knows evil and good, but potentially so does all of the spiritual realm, the heavenly host. They also, if this is in reference to including them, which I think it is. I don't think this is necessarily Trinitarian. I think God, when we look at the rest of Scripture, God is inviting them to participate. Because that's the way God is. God is very selfless. He likes to have people participating in his plan. Not that he was alone. God was not alone, right? He's a Trinity, so by definition, he's never alone.
A question. This is backing up, though.
Sure.
I didn't want to wreck your rolling. You're on a roll. What did you think that when they said that when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God, because there's a distinction between the two. Is there something we should take from that?
Well, the hard part is, okay, we have when we're doing hermeneutics, when we're doing an interpretation, we always say, well, what does the text say? What's the grammar say? What's the culture? But also, what genre is this? And so scholars recognize that the book of Job is under the wisdom literature. And so when God is speaking there, you have the morning stars, and then you have the sons of God, right? So in the book of Psalms, as well as other things, the book of Psalms is poetry, but it speaks about real, true things. But you have very much in Hebrew literature these doublets. So oftentimes you'll have especially in Proverbs, you'll see a proverb, it'll say this, and then it'll say something similar. And what it's doing is it's providing you an extra insight into the first thing, which doesn't mean it's necessarily different, it's just adding another nuance. So you have this parallelism. The question is this parallelism or is it distinction? So, because it's in Job, it's under poetry, even though Job's a normal, it has narrative in it. In this section, they have to answer, is the morning stars identical to the
Isn't
sons
there a
of God?
verse that says the devil is the fallen morning star? How does that?
In Isaiah 14, it says how you have fallen from heaven, Lucifer, but it's son of the dawn. It's not using that same language. But what we do know is that stars, as we've seen before, definitely are angelic. No doubt.
I guess the word that strikes me that Jerry mentioned is all.
Mhm.
All is more encompassing than just the morning
Yes.
stars.
And so what we saw is up here in this particular, it's a little bit hard to, if we go like this, kind of, we did this earlier, but it's probably helpful, is that we have Yahweh up here, and then we have God's divine counsel, we have this, and then we have man, and then we have angels, and then what we saw up here, we went through this before, the sons of God, amongst many others, Gabriel. This is the divine counsel. This is these are the helpful rulers. But you have here all the sons of God and the morning star. So are they in there too? That's a great question.
I just did a word search for morning star.
And?
There's several of them. There's Isaiah 14:12 says, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn.
Mm-hmm.
You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations." I think that was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, so that's most likely a reference to Satan.
Yeah.
And then Jesus is called the morning star. You'll see that in the book of Revelation, so that's interesting. That he is the bright and the morning star.
The Second Peter has one that says, "We also have the prophetic message as something completely reliable that you will do well to pay attention to it as the light is shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts."
Yeah, that's a reference to Jesus.
Uh-huh.
And then you probably see the other one in Revelation.
Revelation says, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star."
Mm-hmm. So, Jesus definitely is a son of God, right? And we know that he is the Son of God in a very unique way. That's, Jesus said, for God to love the world that he gave his one and unique, that's the Greek word, is unique. The kind of the old language is his one and only begotten Son. And now, based on more knowledge that we have, that is not a good translation. I mean, with the King James did that in 1611, that was what the best they had. But now that we have all these manuscripts understanding what words mean now and all the secular Greek writings and others, it means unique, one and only, unique Son, which fits perfectly even better because you have all these sons of God. But Jesus is the unique Son of God. Why? Because he's part of the Trinity, going back from eternity, where these guys are all created. So that's important. Still number 3, we see in Isaiah 6 the vision when God makes the comment, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" And then, you picture Isaiah going, me, I'll go for you, And but remember, God is asking a question: who should we send? Who will go for us? He's inviting this divine council to participate in the fulfillment of his plan, and so we see that. So the main thing here is that, as kind of as a backdrop, we have the heavenly version, the heavenly spiritual world that's filled with these heavenly hosts that are part of God's ruling, and that's their domain. Ours is the earthly domain. That's really the main point here. But God has this comprehensive plan. So we can go to page 2. And what we've been seeing is, I'll get into it more in the next page when we talk about the outline of the book of Genesis. So, number 4 there. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man, his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. So we have this phrase, being made in the likeness of God or being made in the image of God. So what I tried to do here was give you the typical response. Imagine your 10-year-old, mom, dad. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Now, for a young child, what are they most likely going to default to?
What that looks like.
Yeah. what do you think that they would say?
The kid?
Yeah, the kid. God looks like us, looks like a human, has hands, has eyes, 6'3", maybe 5'5", if you want the perfect height. So, but what scholars will wrestle over is, well, okay, and so what I tried to do was list some of these out, but what we do know 100% is that mankind is distinct from animals and the other parts of God's creation through the first 6 days. He sets us apart as being different from them. So I think that it's a little bit more clear, but let's run with it. So intelligence. Do animals have intelligence? Of course they do. Reasoning ability? Yeah, that's a good candidate, right? Do animals reason? Nah, my cat doesn't. I try to explain to him how stupid he is, and he learns by behavior not to do things, but that's behavior, right? That's conditioned by fear of a consequence, right? Emotions. Well, we're like God, right? God has emotions, God has intelligence, God reasons, therefore we do. But do animals have emotions? I think that they've shown that to be the case.
My dog gets depressed.
Yeah, exactly. And so I didn't want to give you like a peer-reviewed article, but I saw some of them. The ability to commune with God, that sounds like a very interesting thing. Self-awareness, sentience. Animals don't have that self-awareness. I mean, I don't picture my cat going and looking in the mirror and going, well, I look pretty handsome today, in that sense. So they don't have that level of self-awareness, true. Language and the ability to communicate. We know animals communicate with one another, right? Dolphins, whales, etc. So birds, no doubt. The presence of a soul or spirit. Mankind is the only one that has the breath of life, but both man and animals have a nefesh or a soul or a spirit. I've given you just a couple examples. We talked about that. Where an animal, the word nefesh in Hebrew generally is referred to as soul, but you'll say like nefesh chayil, meaning like a living soul or a living being, and that's not related to man only. Animals have it, and so I've given you just one couple examples. So, a conscience. Again, we don't see them animals necessarily moping around feeling guilty, or the lion feeling guilty for eating the little baby, gazelle. So is that free will? Is another thing. Morality, is that what it means to be made in the image of God? And then K, physical likeness. That's what I was trying to get at. As a kid, they're going to go, oh, well, God's like us, He looks like us. And Mormonism is very, very clear that God, the Father, has a body of flesh and bone, just like us. So the Father and the Son both have physical, tangible, fleshly bodies. The Holy Spirit does not. I also put on here Kenneth Copeland, prosperity teacher. He said very clear God's about 6'3".
And he's seating right.
And you go, and where he got that was from Isaiah 40:12, where I read his teaching on this, where Isaiah 40 talks about God having a span, his hand, span. And so Kenneth Copeland said, well, my span is this big, and so and he did some sort of mathematical calculation, and he said God was a little bit bigger than him. And you go, I don't even know how to respond, honestly. So, John 4:24, Jesus said God is a spirit, the Father is a spirit. Not that you couldn't be a spirit and flesh, because we're spirit, but what we're talking about here is these anthropomorphisms. And so that's just a fancy word of saying God is using language in order to communicate to us. So, for example, how many of you ever watched, I get to see this often, a grandmother or a mother speak to a baby? Now, how would you feel if they spoke to you that way? You'd probably be offended, right? You'd probably like, hey, I'm an adult. Can you not talk to me like a child? What we recognize is that we, even as humans, maybe it's a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, and I see this often with teachers, even preschool teachers. You know, when they get into the normal adult world, it's hard for them to turn it off because they're used to condescending, not in a mean way, but they're coming down and they're speaking, and then when they get back in the real world, if they don't shut it off, and then Mike understands this because his wife's a teacher.
Well,
So,
I think that's where he got that example.
well, no, I was thinking of Sarah Tran as a preschool teacher because she'll come up and we'll have our meetings, and I'm like, okay, she still hasn't turned it off yet. But we speak this way, and there's no doubt that God, who is the ultimate being, has to condescend to our level and speak human language. He doesn't speak God language to us. He doesn't even necessarily speak angelic language. He speaks in words that in our limited existence, that's the only way we can understand. And a lot of times we ask God, God says, look, I couldn't tell you this. If I told you this, it'd blow your mind, and your mind isn't capable of understanding. Okay, so one of the questions I have there is, you know, like Psalm 110 as an example, you know, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool, right? He's speaking towards Jesus there, the Messiah. So you think, oh, God's right hand, or my eyes go to and fro, throughout the whole earth to see who's faithful to me. Those are anthropomorphic language. It's God is speaking to us so that we, this figurative or metamorphical language, okay, in that sense. Because let me step back. People like the Mormons, as an example, if you talk to them, they take that very literal, even though it's very poetic. And so I put it here, Psalm 91:4, that we hide where? Under the shadow of his wings. Is God a chicken? Does God literally have wings like an angel? We recognize that and go, God is using, you know, this language even in Matthew 23 when Jesus makes the comment, my desire has been to gather you like a mother hen would gather the chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. And so you have this language that God is using to try to communicate, hey, it's great to be under God's care, similar to what you would see as a chicken, you know, little baby chicks or whatever. So we don't necessarily should take any of these literal, because we understand them as being poetic, helping us to understand that God is not a man, right? Numbers 23, we know that. Jesus became a man, but prior to that, his essence is not physical. I guess he would be far more than 6'3" if he says, what temple can you build for me? The heavens themselves are my domain, and the earth is my footstool. You know, what happens is if you don't understand or you don't take into consideration language, and the way that we use it all the time, we have idioms, then we end up over-literalizing. I'm all about interpreting Scripture literally in plain normal language, but we end up becoming, honestly, very foolish.
Is Jesus currently in physical form right now?
I would say absolutely, yeah. He took on physical flesh forever. And so when he was resurrected, he got a new body, a resurrected physical body. And we know that our body will be conformed to his body. So whatever he has, we're going to be made like him, and then we're going to see him. And so that same resurrected body, which for us is physical, that's the commitment level of God's love for us, going way back here, is that Jesus didn't become an angel. He came down and was born under this physical realm, earthly realm. Now granted, somehow, some way, in his deity, he's still able to be omnipresent, which we don't have that, because our true being, the spiritual being, the non-material part of us, is not deity, it's created, it's derivative in that sense. So I would say, yes, Jesus is 100% physical, and he'll be physical forever, and he'll be a human forever. Because we do know, one example is 1 Timothy 2:5, where Paul says, there's one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. Well, that was after his resurrection. So he didn't give up his humanity by any means.
He went through transfiguration, though, right? Well, no.
The transfiguration was prior to the resurrection.
Oh, okay. So
But he was just
when he went up
revealing, he was revealing his inner deity.
You go over these scriptures like a mother hen to its chicks, and there are many more. Like
there's
running
hundreds.
A strong tower.
Yeah, is he a strong tower? Yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of these, but again, not being able to fathom, say, God's language be too overwhelming for us, so He plants within our minds through the Scripture. But I've always looked at all of that in His attributes and characteristics, His power, His strength,
Yeah.
His presence, His, all of it in that mix. I mean, it comes in. I hate to pick on them, but the Mormons and their literal interpretation.
It's very hyper-literal. And for them, they need that because of God's, their doctrine of eternal progression, that God was once a man like us, and He's progressed.
Exactly.
So they need that. Yeah.
I don't know, I just wanted to present that in effect. It just presents all of that.
Well, have you ever heard a husband or wife speak about their spouse as being my rock?
Yeah.
And you go, well, what kind of rock? Metamorphosis rock? Are we talking about secondary? We recognize already that, we get what you mean. But if we force it, we end up, again, if we were to say that out loud and we ask the question seriously, everybody would look at them and go, did you just get to the country to understand the way our idioms work and the way our language works? We'd recognize that. Maybe they did. So we use idioms all the time. So as we think about this, instead of writing them up here, I was going to test you guys. Hey, what's the image of God? And write all these things down. All of these are potential possibilities. Okay? Even if we were to outline, like let's say B, that's reasoning. Let's go self-awareness, because animals kind of don't look in the mirror, as we said. How about a conscience? Let's go H. Free will, let's do that. I. Moral, that's good. J. Even if we said, okay, those are the four that are very distinct from animals. So the image of God is having the ability to reason, having the ability of self-awareness, having a conscience, having morality. We also know in L that both men and women are included equally. All of these are not equally present in all human beings at all times. So, for example, babies and mentally handicapped people, we'll keep going for a minute. And some are not unique to human beings. We talked about those. Animals. Oh, this was really good. This is something that Heiser brought up in his book, Unseen Realm, which I thought was very appropriate. There are pro-life ramifications for defining the image of God incorrectly. If we say it's B, E, H, I, and J, then what we're saying is that a baby that is 6 weeks old in the womb is not human. Because they don't have a reasoning ability yet. They don't have self-awareness yet. So what he mentions, he goes, we got to be careful with this. If we define the image of God as connecting these, then we just lost the pro-life argument. Because there is no partial, they have potential. They're potential humans. Well, pro-death people say, yes! Thank you for acknowledging what we've been saying all along. They're not humans yet, they're potential. Well, when do they become real? After they're born. So up until the moment, or maybe even after, you can kill a potential and you haven't committed. So we recognize and go, okay, before we answer this theologically, we got to find something that works in all of the areas. And so all the ones you see, A through whatever, just cross them out. Just put a big X. That is not the image of God of what it means in Scripture, because if it does, we're in trouble. It has to mean something else. And I think he does a good job of that. So I have a quote here from this other Hebrew scholar. He wrote a whole book on this. What makes man the image of God is not that corporeal or physical man stands as an analogy of a corporeal God. Okay? So the image of God is not like the little child saying, God is physical and we're physical and we have hands and eyes. For the image does not primarily mean similarity, but the representation of the one, that's very important, of the one who is imaged in a place where he is not. According to Genesis 1:26, what does FF mean?
Compare.
Nope, that's CF.
Oh.
FF means and the following. So Genesis 1:26 and the rest, he wrote that in there. But according to Genesis 1:26 and the following verses, man is set on earth in order to be the representative there of the absent God who is nevertheless present by his image. This, I think, is getting to the heart of it, that when God creates man to be his imagers, he said, hey, I'm living up here. God's omnipresent, there's no doubt. But I'm living up here. If we do this, this is going to be the line of physical, and then we're going to put unseen, all right, or spiritual. God says, well, my domain is primarily spirit, but I've created this place, and I've created the earth for you in its physical environment, and I'm always with you, of course, but I want you to be, this is your domain. I've given the earth to you, right? Psalm 115. The heavens are mine. They're not yours. The earth is yours. So go and image me. And we'll see this in a minute. So number 5 there. What is the direct outcome of being God's vice regent or representative? All right. This is Genesis 1:28. So God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." What's our domain? The earth, right? So in 127 at the top of the page, God created man in his own image. The image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And then he goes on to say, be fruitful, multiply, fill, subdue, and rule. So right here at the beginning, we don't need to guess that the image of God is referenced in 27, and then I think it's explained in 28. The image of God is primarily exemplified, or you want to say that, by ruling and taking dominion or subduing. So
by action.
By action. I would totally agree. So, letter A there. Reproduce and fill the earth with other imagers. So God isn't creating new imagers. He's saying, I've given you the responsibility to reproduce and the ability, and as you reproduce, we're going to create more imagers.
He created us for himself. He also wants us to know himself, and therefore if we take on his attributes because we've studied and learned as he has commanded us, then that is his image.
Absolutely.
No matter what we look like.
Yeah, and no matter how many days from fertilization all the way on, that's a real human, and every human being. That's why, when we get into some of these race issues that are currently, it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
If you're a human, you're an imager, and you have dignity. You have quality and value. Why? Not because any of us have value in ourselves, but because we're human, and by definition, God has said, "I have created you with value." There's only one race. We know that. It's the human
the
race.
same color blood.
Exactly. We just, as we know, we have different intensities of melanin.
Yes.
Okay? And that's it. And so we can all breed together, right? We're all the same kind. It doesn't matter. In fact, when you mix different colors, you usually get really beautiful children.
Yeah.
In that regard. Okay? But what God is saying here is, I've created you to go and to be my imagers in the world. Okay? Now this, we have to remember that this is still here. We're still in innocence and perfection and goodness. We haven't corrupted anything yet. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking if we use the same reasoning to X off A through O, or up there, really, because we haven't been born into the earth yet, wouldn't we use that same reasoning for B, C, and D? And it really comes down to just A. We are the image of God at conception.
That's why I say some of these things, these are great. And we're not saying that we don't have these.
Oh yeah, I'm not.
Yeah, like God, right?
Those are necessary, but
Yeah.
not sufficient.
Yep, that's a great way. Necessary but not sufficient, because we are moral. We do have a conscience, and certainly God is moral. God has emotions, and so we're like Him in those other ways as well. But that's more about, I would say, livingness. If you wanted to make a category of personhood, we might even there be careful, because we might say, is a cat a person? Well, we know that do animals have personality?
Yeah.
Certainly they do. So we want to say, well, in some ways they have a personhood because they exhibit personality. So that's more of the, if we were to talk about ontology or the study of being, and we started making distinction, we'd say, oh, well, if we talk about that, then, well, animals even are like God in one sense, that they have living sense, they're sentient, right? They are living beings, they have a living soul like God does. You know, they have a spirit like God does, they have personality like God does. Well, hey, so do we. But we're not talking about ontology here. We're talking about the image of God, specifically. And that's clearly the distinction that we have in Genesis, that we are made distinct from the animals. And so we're trying to understand what that means, even though, as you said, they have intelligence. Oh, animals have intelligence, different level, right? We have more intelligence. And if you look at animals, there's different animals that have different levels of intelligence as you get up. And is that because of the size of the brain? There's more capability, potential? I mean, I'm not a biologist, but you tell me. But nevertheless, you see that. But we're not talking about that. And so for us, we're not going to define the image of God in those ways, even though we understand similarities. That's very true. It's a good distinction that we should make. Number 5 there on the bottom, letter B, subdue the earth. Another way is harness its potential and use its resources for your benefit. That it's good for us to cultivate the land. It's good for us to mine. It's good for us to understand the laws of physics. Every time, a Christian becomes a biologist or a physicist or whatever, and they're seeking to understand God's creation and see His glory in it, whether it's at the micro level or at the macro level of astronomy, telescopes, etc. We are, even unbelievers, are fulfilling this and glorifying God, some more than others, by fulfilling this mandate, which is learning about this creation. We're learning about the order that this world that God gave us. And part of that is, humanity just has this desire, wrong or right, to know. Otherwise, there would never be any money for research, right? We could spend our money on a lot of things. But we have chosen, even in our society, to spend billions of dollars, on NASA. Why? Well, because we want to research. We want to send probes out to understand the planets. And granted, their method or their reasoning isn't to glorify God, but the whole creation science movement is awesome because as they seek to do it, they get more and more, and God does get the glory. The more and more we read about DNA and its complexity and the micro, the microbiology, we go, man, God's amazing at the way that He's put all these systems, these thousands and thousands of systems together, and they operate perfectly.
Well, there's a lot of now investments that are what they call biblically responsible, and how they're raising up the level that everybody wins in the way God sets it up. In other words, the user wins, the producer wins, the worker wins. Everybody wins, and it can work that way. But it's the sin in the world where it tries to take corruption and greed and put it into this godly system of making it work.
Right. To me, I'm looking forward to the 1,000-year reign when Jesus is ruling, because I'm very curious of whether, he's going to say, okay, everybody, we're going back to, 2nd century agrarian life. Or is he going to say, let me show you how technology can be used for the glory of God in righteousness. And so he funds research, which would be this, subduing the earth and harnessing its potential. And he'll say, just wait till you guys get to discover all the way that my Father, well, Jesus is the creator, how I've created the world and its laws, its physical laws to work. And so now we can harness electricity out of the air because we know that there's electricity in the air, right? Static electricity, we use that. But we're too dumb so far to be able to harness it for free. So will that be the way it is? I don't know. That would certainly be exciting. And it would be done with righteousness. And as the economy, there's going to be economy during the millennium, there's no doubt. We look at an economy that is done not out of greed, but still embraces freedom, but looks out for others. All these things. But this is part of the original creation. Hey guys, I want you to reproduce, fill the earth, but also subdue it and harness its potential. Letter C there, this is all under the image. Rule and or govern, and I put on here similar to 1 Corinthians 6, where we adjudicate the world and the angels. God says, go out and rule. And this is very clear, a word for rule. And it is, this is, I think, probably the easiest and the highest, if I was to put the image of God, get rid of this, over here, under just a couple categories, I would say one would be subdue, and the other one would be rule. This is what we are, and we're God's extension. He said, I made you to be imagers of me. I made you with the capacity to represent me, because God, no doubt, is the ruler over everything. But he says, this is your domain. I want you to go there and represent me well in righteousness and holiness and all that good stuff. That's our destiny. So, I find it interesting, letter D there, God gives the commands here in Genesis 1 and 2, and then in Genesis 3 we screw it up. Well, then as we know, Genesis 4, you have Cain and Abel, murder. Genesis 5 is just a genealogy. Genesis 6 now, mankind is becoming corrupt. We'll talk about more how that corruption took place in a couple weeks with angels and mating and women and Nephilim and all that. But after the flood is over, he reduces mankind down to 8. And he says to them, okay, Noah, you have your 3 boys, their 3 wives, so you have 4 men, 4 women, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I want you to... He reiterates. But God repeats himself in reminding them to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 9, 1 and 7, but does not reiterate the command to rule. Some scholars suggest that mankind lost the immediate ability to fulfill their role as rulers due to sin. They must wait until they are redeemed and made perfect by Jesus, who once again grants believers the right to rule with him in the millennium. So, it doesn't mean we lost the image of God, but God doesn't reiterate the rulership part, knowing that we, even though we're still called to image him and these other things, that this one kind of has been put on hold a little bit, so to speak. I don't know. It's a speculation, but I find it interesting that he does not repeat that. I don't know.
We're supposed to obey our rulers, though, because God put them in those positions.
Yeah.
So I guess we do have rulers.
Yeah. But, I mean, in the sense of ruling... There's no doubt there's rulership, because here even in Genesis 9, which we'll get to, I think, it's up at the top, that if you are a Bible-believing Christian, then you have to believe in the death penalty. Because Genesis 9:6 is very clear that, I put that on there up the top, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man.
Or not in our Old Testament rules.
Now, this is prior. This is prior to Moses.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, so this isn't part of the Mosaic system. So remember, we're not unhitching from the Old Testament. We're saying, especially in Galatians, that we don't follow Mosaic legislation. This was prior to any of that.
Is that Melchizedek?
Pre-flood, there was no delegated rulership. The rulership was delegated to all. Post-flood, you started to see this pattern of nations,
Yep.
kings, and designated
Human government, so to speak.
human governments.
That's where you're talking about Romans 13. Notice it says, whoever murders by man, that person's blood, they're going to be killed. So what God now says is, I'm instituting the death penalty that is going to be executed by humans, or by human governments. Why? Because I cannot allow you to dismiss that every single human being is made in my image and it has value. That if someone kills somebody else, they forfeited their own. We cannot allow that to stand.
I found it really interesting with an amazing connection with in Acts 15, and since you're going through Galatians, the council they're dealing with the Mosaic law, and how do we deal with that? James, ratifies or brings up the dietary mention of blood still in the meat from the same chapter here in Genesis. So you're seeing that there's a clear jumping past the Mosaic law. It's still dealing with what was said right after the flood.
Right after the flood.
It's super validated, although it's so even further back.
Yep.
So it's really interesting that James actually clearly jumps to that same spot.
Yep. And I'm going to bring that up later because I didn't go through all of it here, but as God is giving them instructions about their diet, after the flood, now they're able to eat meat. Genesis 1:28 or 1:29 says, I've given you all, they're all vegetarians. Okay? That's how you start. And it was not allowed, but after the flood, God says you can eat anything you want, but not the blood. So that command is still universal. And so what you have in Judaism today is you have there's a certain group, I used to deal with them all the time in evangelism. They're called the Lubavitch Group. They're a group of rabbinic, a branch of rabbinic Judaism, the Hasidic Jews, curly hair, long hats. But man, if you go to New York and you're doing evangelism and you see these guys, they have their Lubavitch vehicle like an RV and like a big motorhome, and they're out there and they're trying to get people to do commandments. And so anyways, we're walking there, and I had a buddy of mine who was Jewish, and I walk up to him. Now these guys, the average Hasidic Jew will probably spit on you, okay?
I've experienced that.
Yes. And if you're a woman and you happen to say hello, he will ignore you. The man will ignore any other woman that's not his wife. But these guys are different because they came up and they go, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "No." I go, "He is." And they go, "Oh, okay, come with us." So they bring us into their vehicle, and he says, "Okay, for you, you're not Jewish." So he gives me this little card with the 7 Noahide Laws. You know, it's this. And you'll see these Noahide Laws, which they say for you need to follow Genesis 9. Because this is for Noah and all of the descendants. But for Jews, they have to follow Torah. All 613, if they can. So for my buddy, they brought him and they put the phylactery on his head and they put the tefillin on his arm, and then he said a little prayer because their job for him was to help him follow the commandments for that day. And they said, we're helping make the world better by helping this guy follow the mitzvot, right? The commandments. For you, you're not a Jew. You're not required. See, you're not required to follow the law. You're not Jewish. So even they get it, okay? That for a Gentile, I'm not required. But he gave me the card and said, hey, make sure that you don't eat any meat with blood. So make sure your steak is not rare, okay? But and this is what they'll do. So that particular group is going out there encouraging us to follow the laws of Noah, which is Genesis 9. And includes a death penalty, includes eating whatever we want. See, he told me, you can eat whatever you want. You don't need to eat kosher. You're not Jewish. Appreciate that. Okay?
It was reiterated in Peter, the sheep, the animals, eat anything you want.
Yep, I'm going to read that today. Okay? So let's go to page 3.
Real quick,
Yeah.
in chapter 9 Genesis, there were a few more things that were laid down there. He also mentioned the fact that even creatures will get punishment out of for eating blood. Is that not correct? And also the reason we don't kill is because every man's a relative.
Well, yes. And that they have inherent value because they're human.
Understood.
And so, for us, Genesis 9 still applies. It's never been rescinded. And I'll talk about this later when we get into the other, talking about some of the ways that God modifies His law for certain situations. But it's interesting that, Malachi 3:6, right? I am the Lord, I do not change. But we assume that means that God cannot change His law. Well, if He gave the law there, that means it's forever. God reserves the right to change His laws He sees fit. And we see this here. It used to be vegetarian. Then it became meat. For the Jews, it was kosher. And then now in the church period, it's anything you want again. That doesn't mean God has His essence. When He says, I am the Lord, I change not, He's talking about His essence. His moral character. That's why for us, we recognize that if God says to you, hey, I'm commanding you that every morning at 6 a.m. you will do 10 jumping jacks. If you do not do it, you're immoral now. You mean it's immoral, Lord? If I command you and you don't, then yes, I can create laws any time I want. But for you, I didn't give that. I didn't give the command to that guy, so he doesn't have to do jumping jacks. But for you, yes. That's why if God commands, like Jonah, go to Nineveh and he doesn't, was that an immoral thing?
Yes.
Of course it was, right? God reserves the right to make commands, which might seem very odd, and we don't understand. I mean, think about all the 613 laws about various things. Mixing clothing, you know? I mean, don't plant 2 seeds in your field. I mean, all these things that he had a reason. I'm not saying they're meaningless. He had his reasons, even if we might disagree with them or might not understand them. He still had his reasons in it. And honestly, God says, I don't need to have a reason. Right?
Wasn't that his training ground at that point?
Well, he did do it to keep Israel very distinct in the world.
Right.
And separated, and they were well known.
Yeah.
Pardon?
He does in Deuteronomy say that it's to sanctify
It's
people.
to separate them, yeah.
Who wants to invite the Jews over? What do I cook?
Especially today, when we get into Galatians, this is very helpful because, you know, the things that distinguished a Jew primarily was circumcision, the Sabbath, and how you ate. Those 3 are the big ones. So, you know, if you'd say, hey, come over on, you know, it's Friday night, let's do something. Sorry. Oh, that's right, you're Jewish. Imagine living back in the time of Jesus and you were a Gentile and you might have had a Jewish friend or a coworker, or maybe you worked together. And he said, I can't. Oh, that's right. Oh, by the way, you're probably circumcised. Yeah. Hey, well, you know, how about coming over on Sunday morning and let's have some bacon? Can't do that. You know. Oh, that's right, you're Jewish. You have those things that make them very clearly distinct. So, what I want to talk about the last 10 minutes is what we see. This to me, I find this very fascinating in that the creation of mankind, the garden and the gate, you know, the Garden of Eden as a gateway between heaven and earth, because God and his unseen host live somewhere else, right? In the sense that outside of our view, physically. But God creates earth and he plants this garden. Now, the garden is not Eden, okay? That's an important distinction. Because why is that? Eden is the land, and it's not the whole earth either. Eden, think about Eden as being a county, okay? So here you have Eden, and then God creates this garden over here. And this is just Eden, and what we know is it's somewhere in the east. We don't... East of Israel, most likely, is because when Moses is writing this, he's writing this from really the wilderness, right? During the 40 years. Okay, so right there at the top, this is Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts. He just got done. That's Genesis 1. By the seventh day, God completed His work which He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. Verse 4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made earth and heaven. So what I put on here is not to get fancy on you, but the Hebrew word here is toledot. It means generations. It means the account. It means the history. And the book of Genesis, I put there A through J, is divided into these 10 different toledot, these histories. So scholars will recognize that the whole book of Genesis is not certainly comprehensive or exhaustive, but it's giving us an outline of how things progressed in the early period, right? And so I put on here, this is important. What comes first, the writing of Genesis or the history of Genesis? History. So I put here 5000 BC, creation of the world, let's say. You have all this time going by, Genesis 3, flood, Babel. So 1400, so you have 3600 years of human history taking place before Moses writes down to the Jewish people what really happened over here. So you have, by the time you get here, what are some cultures that have existed? Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian for sure, Chaldean, Neo-Babylonian, Akkadian. You have, all of India, all of those things. You have a lot of people existing by the time, especially with Babel, once they all got spread. And Moses comes along and this is really important, he's writing to the Jews, these Israelites that have been wandering in the wilderness, or starting to. They've come out of Egypt. They have a history of Abraham coming out of Aram, and that whole Mesopotamian kind of culture, the Tigris, Euphrates. And he comes in and says, hey guys, you guys have heard a lot of this in human history. A lot of the mythology, a lot of the theology, a lot of the ways that the world was created. I'm writing to you now the true history. That's super important. That when Moses writes this, he's writing it in the context of a whole bunch of Near Eastern background, which we have some insight to, with all the cuneiform that have been discovered, and all the writings, and Hammurabi, and his code, and all these other things. Okay. What he begins to do is to tell us, let me tell you about the early history. The word here in 4, this is the history of the heavens and the earth. And what it means is, every time this word appears, it'll say, like the next one, this is the history of Adam. This is the history of Noah. And the word appears, this Toledot appears, and then it follows about telling you how it worked itself out. Hey, this is what happened with Adam. This is how it worked out. This is what happened with Noah. This is how that worked out. It always comes first. But what's fascinating is that this first section says, okay, everybody, we learned in chapter 1 that God created the heavens and the earth. Well, let me tell you how it worked out. Not very well, okay? Because he goes into chapter 2 about the planting of the garden. So, chapter 1, heaven and earth is done. It's over. But let's talk about how that worked itself out. Well, the first thing God did is he created this garden in a land called Eden. He put man there. And then he went there. He failed in the garden. Genesis 4 happens. So I've given you this just kind of for fun.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When it's saying the heavens and the earth, it's saying like the heavens, like outer space, that kind of, or heavenly realm, unseen realm. What's the?
I think it's physical.
Okay. All
Yep.
right. So like
The stars.
expanse outside of where
Yep.
the earth is. Okay.
So God created the earth not to be by itself, but why did he create the stars? Genesis 1:14.
His glory.
Seasons. It is for his glory. And he says, hey, I'm giving you the lesser light, the greater light, I'm giving you the stars so that you can understand the seasons. So that you know in the fall, if you go outside, at least I know this, if you go out in the fall and you look up, what are you going to see? You're going to see Orion. It's awesome. I know that if I see Orion out there, it's fall. And so that always reminds me, if you see the summer triangle, well, by definition, you go out and you see the summer triangle. You see these stars, these constellations are meant to give us a reminder of the seasons. So God created the whole universe pretty big for his glory to show off. I mean, Psalm 19 says that. On a Wednesday afternoon, he just threw all the universe out there, hundreds of billions of stars, trillions. You can't even I just did that on a Wednesday afternoon. Okay, for you. But for signs and seasons. And big enough so that he knows that we're going to get our telescopes out, we're still not going to see the end. Okay? So you see that. So the history of the heavens and earth is the physical, I think, as it relates to the rest of this. Number 2, God created the garden as a location for his new created earthly family to live in communion with him. The garden or orchard, that's really what it is. It means place of delight and luxury, was not called Eden, but was in the location of a region. This was a place where God could dwell with his earthly family as well as commune with his heavenly family. I find it interesting that let's put something out here for a moment. God, I don't think that the garden, we'll see it in a minute, this was a place of God's dwelling on earth. God can't dwell, right? He's bigger than everything. But he says, hey, he walked in the garden with them. We know that. But I also think, and I think I can show it to you, at least very strong, that there were other Elohim in the garden. Okay? Adam and Eve, this was their domain, but they were used to seeing God there. They were used to seeing the other divine council there. That's why when this snake-like figure shows up, she doesn't blink. She's like, yeah. And it's interesting that, we'll see this next week, that one of the things that Satan says to her is, God knows that when you eat of the tree, you're going to be like the other Elohim. They obviously knew about Elohim. You're going to be like the other gods. You're going to be like these other guys that know. And we also know in Genesis 3:22 that they understood, they did have a knowledge of good and evil. And so when he speaks to Eve, he says, God knows. See, Yahweh's tricking you because he knows that if you eat of that, you're going to be like all these other guys. And so to me, it was speculation a little bit. But I have a feeling that that Eden was this gateway or this place of connecting the heavenly as well as the earthly realm. And they operated smoothly. They operated in union with one another, in harmony.
Do you think that, because I kind of see it like an overlap.
Definitely an overlap.
Diagram of like the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. But when, and that's been severed. Sometimes there's overlap, obviously, here and there. But do you think, and I think isn't it during the 1,000-year reign when we will rule and reign with Christ as resurrected beings, and so the heavenly and the earthly are going to be overlapped again?
I think so, because it's hard for me. Okay, the verbiage I mentioned earlier in 1 Corinthians 6:3. It says, don't you know that you will judge? Okay? If you can't judge amongst yourself, and you're going to be judging the world, and you're going to be judging angels. Okay? The Greek word there, we tend to think, oh, well, when we get there, we're going to oversee the judgment of Satan and all the fallen angels, right? We're going to give them their sentence, okay? Let's say it that way. God says, okay, church, my people, I want you to come up here and I want you to provide judgment over them. But that's kind of a one-time thing, right? They're done, it's over. It's not meant as a completed action. That's why I like the word adjudicate, or another way to say it would be to make decrees, which is our job is going to be ruling and reigning, making decrees, making decisions like a legislative body over angels. Which is really fascinating to me that's where you do mix. Our future is mixing our domain is still earth, but we're going to be part of that divine council where we're going to be part of that decree. That's why I think this is the unseen realm. You have the divine council and you have other angels that are not part of it. So when we jump up here to be part of this, our decrees influence not just these guys, but also the rest of whatever humanity looks like during that millennium. It's hard for me to interpret this any other way, unless it's just a one-time shot. Here's your sentence here in the lake of fire. Okay, done. But if we continually make decrees and adjudicate over God's original design, however that looked. Letter C there, God, I find this fascinating. You only see this in Hebrew. God rested the man and the woman there to work and to keep guard the sacred space. Man's original design, it says, most versions say God put the man. It's the word Noach. It's the word rested. God rested him there. It's a great thing to be in the garden, to cultivate it and to tend it. D, mankind was to work, serve in the garden. This wording is similar to those priests later who served in the temple. Also, mankind was to keep and guard the sacred earthly space of God's dwelling. This is similar wording to Genesis 3. And as we know, up here, the cherubim and the seraphim, they also keep and guard the throne. Not that God needs them, but He's invited them to be part of His bodyguard. And just as we see, because man screwed up over here, we didn't do our job at keeping and guarding the garden. Now God, because we sinned, God sends a cherub to do our job. So we lost it. There's a certain sense of us losing the responsibility. Okay, mankind's task was to cultivate and keep the garden and take the concept of Eden and righteously spread it throughout the whole earth as they multiplied and ruled. Now this is, in ancient Near Eastern religious thinking, lush gardens with rivers and mountains were the dwelling places of the gods. The same imagery is used in Isaiah and Ezekiel. Which came first, the book of Genesis or mythology? So, the reason I bring that question up as we wrap it up is that Moses is writing the true history of Eden. And he describes Eden, not just the garden, as a place of gold, as a place of luxurious gardens, as a place of water. And as they're going, I imagine them going, hey, we learned that in Mesopotamia, that all of their theology speaks about, well, all their gods dwell on mountains, all their gods dwell in gardens. And what Moses comes along and says, yeah, they got that thinking from the reality of the Garden of Eden going through history, but now I'm giving you a written history of exactly what it really meant. So when Moses is writing this, they're going, yeah, we understand. It's not surprising that God originally would live in a garden, because all the other Mesopotamian, that's what their gods do. And he
Moses
says,
is just trying to set the record straight.
he's setting the
God's
record
setting the record
straight.
through Moses.
We're not saying that there was really these false gods living in, or whatever, living in gardens. But it's interesting that these Elohim, these rebels that started creating their own theology, they started teaching that they dwell in gardens, and because they wanted to be like Genesis 3 or Genesis 1 and 2.
It's interesting that you debate atheists. What they like to do is turn around and say Judaism and Christianity is a
Copycat. Copycat, right?
Copycat
Oh,
of this
yeah.
stuff, because there's truisms to what these
Yep.
ancient peoples did. If you wanted to, but it actually just points out that that we're all coming from the same origin.
Yep.
In the same way, there's all these flood stories.
They got it through oral history, continued passed down.
Yep.
We got it through inspired history. But in reality, which came first? We know that the writing, remember, the writing came later. But Moses gave the true version of what happened over here. Therefore, it's not copycat at all. It's providing the true history. Like, again, you look at all the cultures of the world, they have flood stories. Gilgamesh, right? All that stuff, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, you name it, every culture does. They have different versions. There's a lot of similarities that appear in the book of Genesis, and it's very, very interesting to do this.
Satan's a copycat, right?
Oh, for sure. And he doesn't even necessarily need to copy it, even though I agree with you.
Right.
They're just writing down their oral tradition.
Right.
And of course it gets
Yeah. convoluted
expanded and
after a while.
convoluted, and Moses comes along and says, yeah, I know you guys heard about a flood, I know you guys heard about these semi-divine beings, or these divine beings coming down mating with women. I know all the Greek gods, the demigods, right? He goes, I'm going to give you the true version.
Yeah. So they were playing, like mankind was playing the 4,600 year telephone game.
Correct.
Moses
Perfect
went
example.
to God and said,
Yeah.
God told Moses, no, this is what the message really
This is the
said.
account, yeah.
This is
Yeah.
the real history.
Oral
But-
teaching forever, that it's just the opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We
Yep.
picked up last on all of this.
Yeah, we're a Johnny-come-lately religion.
Plagiarized.
That's why
Plagiarized. There's been gods dying and rising from the dead. Christianity isn't anything new. And we go, yeah, of course. But as we come to see the real history, again, oral tradition, telephone game, I like that. Last one here, H. The Greek word referencing the garden, no surprise, is the word paradise. And it reappears in the New Testament where Jesus speaks about paradise. Remember, what does it say to the thief on the cross? Today you will be with me
Oh,
in paradise. So the idea of Eden, if we go over here, the Eden mythology, or I'm speaking wrong. Mythology is not, it's a literary word, okay? We understand in common English, if something's a myth, it's false. But when you speak about literary, ancient literature, mythology is another word, a synonym is just story, okay? So if I say mythology accidentally, I'm meaning the word story. In the story, or the themes, or the motifs of Eden, is this idea of paradise, luxury, delights, and Jesus says to the thief, you're going to be with me there. And in fact, Paul visited paradise, and the new Edenic vision will be accomplished through the work of the gospel. Later in the book of Revelation, Jesus says, everybody who overcomes, I will bring him, and we're going to rule together in paradise. So what we see during the millennium is the Eden restored with Jesus as our ruler, as a man, fulfilling the mandate of Genesis 1 to be fruitful, multiply, and to rule. Jesus is a perfect human, and he's going to lead us into that. And he's called us all, I think on the back page, we're not going to do it, I just did this for reference. You can look at some of the thing, is that Jesus came to redeem us. Why? So that we can righteously fulfill the original comprehensive plan of taking God's dwelling and expanding it throughout the earth. And the millennium is going to be one of the main places that we do that. And then when we get to Revelation 21 and 22, that's the sin-free complete version. But we go from one beginning to the end, and it circles all the way back. But in the meantime, here we are. The tragedy of human history and sin. But Jesus came to die to rescue us and get us to our destiny. Okay? So, next week, we will jump in to see how we ruined it all. All right? Let's pray. Yeah, Father, we come, we thank you that, again, here we are just in Genesis 1 and 2, and we get a glimpse of what you have planned for us, and that we are your imagers. You have called us, even now as Christians, that we are called to go out and let our light shine. Why? So that people can glorify you, not us. We know that apart from you, we can do nothing. So we ask that as we take the gospel, the good news, I mean, here we are going into the world, into all the nations, in order to show them who you are. And we're going to see a little bit more as it relates to how the gospel undoes the work of sin at certainly in the garden in Genesis 6 and even the Tower of Babel. And we just pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.